Parliament is unable to perform its functions as it should.
One of the areas that our Parliament has not fared well is oversight and private members' legislation. Even though the performance and effectiveness of Ghana's Parliament continue to be rated high internationally, its rating in the area of oversight is unsurprisingly low. I say it is unsurprising because Parliament and its committees lack the needed support and assistance to perform their oversight functions. I had calls in March this year to call out the Minister of Finance and the Secretary to the President for attempting to unilaterally place a ceiling on the budget appropriation for Parliament and the judiciary. I must admit, this unfortunate development has been the practice of almost all the governments since the beginning of the Fourth Republic. This development has undoubtedly affected the capacity of Parliament to effectively and efficiently perform its oversight duties. I admit that there has been some modest improvement in the appropriation for Parliament by successive governments, but it is still far inadequate to meet the optimal requirements of the House. It is a fact that there are some hard-working employees of the service who are giving up their best for the service and Parliament. But it is equally true that there is a significant number whose contribution is nothing to write home about. There are some staff who basically have no schedules and so virtually do nothing, yet are paid by the state at the end of each month. Monitoring and supervision by superiors are poor and must be improved if we are determined to attain the vision of being a model parliament.
So that was Sumana Kingsford Alban Bagbin, Speaker of Ghana's Parliament, reiterating a lot of reasons why Parliament is unable to keep the executive in check. And you heard him raise quite a number of issues there. And so that's the basis upon which today we are going to have our conversation and try and understand really whether perhaps a constitutional review may be the way to go. And if it is, what more do we need to consider this time round? And so without saying much though, we are going to speak to quite a number of people. One of such persons is a governance expert, Bafo Ajimandua. And he studied Ghana's political terrain for several years, many years. And he's going to help us understand a few things. Also, we'll be speaking to some members of Parliament to gauge their views on this, as well as a lawyer, a constitutional lawyer, to take us through the possibility of this even being a reality, and particularly on the back of the work done by the Constitutional Review Commission some years ago. We do not even know what has become of that report that was submitted to the executive. As to whether those recommendations are going to be even looked at again. I was hearing that there may perhaps be another review. As to whether that's true, we cannot even tell. And so there's a lot going around, except that we are not getting as much as we want to from the Constitution. And so at this point, let me rope in Bafo Ajimandua, who is a governance expert, and Jonah Eledi of our newsroom and the production team has been speaking to him about some of these issues I've been bringing to your attention. And so I want us to take a listen to him first. Once we listen to that very conversation between Jonah Eledi and Bafo Ajimandua, we will return and start our conversation with our other guests who are on standby for us.
The nature of our parliament over the years, how they have operated. Would you say they have been independent of themselves?
Well, the Constitution has given us a system where the three legs of governance are supposed to be independent of each other. These three, as we know, are the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Then, in the case of the legislature, the parliament, the Constitution requires the president to take the majority of his cabinet members from within parliament. In other words, parliamentarians are also brought into the executive branch to serve as ministers. This is what we call the hybrid system, mixing the presidential system of the Americans and the parliamentary system of the British. What this has done is to dilute the independence of the legislature, because if majority of the president's cabinet appointees are to come from the legislature, then it means that we have fused the legislature and the executive. So take for instance, if you are parliamentarian and you are appointed a minister, certainly your loyalty will be shifted away from parliament, where you were elected to serve, to the executive, where of course you become a presidential appointee. So if you are appointed by the president, you are serving the president, how can you go back to the parliament where the president has submitted a bill or a proposal, a policy proposal, and you being a member of the executive voting against it or resisting that particular presidential policy initiation? So we have a situation where it's almost impossible for parliament to be truly independent, as everybody wants to say. That in itself has been a big block to the independence of the legislature. But now the question is, under the circumstances, can parliament be independent? Can it be truly, free to do its work? It's difficult, but I think there is a way. More and more, I think the parliamentarians are beginning to see the need for some kind of collaboration between the two parties in parliament. We saw a glimpse of that recently when the parliament voted almost en masse to approve the presidential nominees for the cabinet. So that realization maybe has come about because of the hung parliament that we have now. So certainly it's not going to be easy, but I think if the two parties in parliament realize the need to put the nation ahead of the parochial interests of the two parties, then hopefully they can cooperate to make parliament more effective.
Has this phenomenon then weakened the parliament so that it cannot even exercise its oversight responsibility over the executive?
That's correct. The description I've given about the fused parliament or the mixed parliament limits parliament's ability to exercise the oversight, because as I've explained earlier, it's very difficult for a parliament whose part of it is executive and is expected to exercise oversight over the executive. That conflict will always be there for people or parliamentarians who are also serving in the government. So as I said, this has been the main limiting factor to the independence of the legislature.
There's been the concern raised, or some have suggested that to address this issue, we should amend the constitution so that the president will not have the opportunity to appoint 2/3 of his ministers from parliament. How feasible is this suggestion that have been put forward?
Well, it's not a simple thing. If we do that, then certainly parliament can become more aggressive and hopefully more effective in playing the oversight role. However, the other side of the story is that if we get to that situation also, a more aggressive parliament can frustrate the government from achieving its development objectives, because the president is required by the constitution to submit for the approval of parliament not only appointees to certain positions in government, but also approval for agreements with other nations, approval for loans, approval for certain policy initiatives that require the public expenditure and all. So if you have a strict separation, which most Democrats want, because that will ensure the full independence of the legislature. But if you have that, Then the downside of that is the possibility of any government also being held hostage by a more aggressive legislature. But that in itself might not be bad, because that will certainly compel the legislature and the executive to reach compromises, to find middle ground on the things that the government would like to do. So my personal view is that, yes, we should separate the two and then compel the executive to consult Parliament all the time whenever it's going to introduce new legislation or agreement to be approved or policy initiative. I think that will help to build consensus and compromises in our governance structure.
Also, to what extent does the attrition rate in Parliament, where we have more experienced people leaving Parliament because either their parties feel that someone else should represent them in the constituency, or there's someone with a lot of money coming in and so the grassroots prefer them. How is this affecting the institution Parliament and how they exercise their control?
Well, that's also another difficult question, because I've heard arguments, especially pushed by the present majority leader, Sechi Mensah, that they should find a way to preserve the veterans, so to speak, those who have been in Parliament for years, because the experience will be needed and all. Yes, that is true. At the same time, I think that the decision to select a Parliament should be left to the constituencies if we are really practicing people's democracy. The Constitution requires people to select whoever they want in Parliament. So if the people decide that every election we are going to change our parliamentarian, that is a democratic decision. I have no problem at all with that. Because we don't want to also create a situation where people go there and take it as a career-long engagement, and forever they are parliamentarians. And as they become weak, they become their experience will not even matter anymore, because the turf will have been so familiar with them. They will take so many things for granted. So occasionally bringing in fresh blood is good. There's a good example by the American system, where their legislature, their Congress, elections are staggered. Every 2 years, there's an election. And whenever there's an election, a certain percentage of the members of the House will be due for election, while the other percentage will not be due. So this allows for this infusion that we're talking about. So always they retain a proportion of the veterans, the old parliamentarians or old congressmen in the House. So that is something perhaps we can also learn from. Instead of every 4 years having a wholesale election for everybody to step out and try to come in again. In that case, theoretically it's possible to lose all parliamentarians and bring in all fresh people. That can be a disaster in terms of continuity and institutional memory and all of that. So maybe the system whereby a percentage of maybe a 50% or so of the parliamentarians are retained, and they will become due for election after a particular election. That is a way to rotate nicely without losing old members. So it's something that I think we can find a way to innovatively bring about.
Doc, lastly, we have also witnessed in recent times an issue where the political parties themselves want to dictate to Parliament itself how they should go about their duty. How worrying is this situation, and how can we resolve it, where Parliament, the members of Parliament are allowed to do their work whilst at the same time serving the interest of their parties through whose platform they got elected into Parliament, so that we can strengthen the institution?
That's correct. That's a very, very good question. At the same time, difficult question. In most democracies, like the Americans and the others, after the elections, the political parties withdraw and allow those elected to run the show, to be part of governance. But in our case, I think the political parties seem to be integrated into the whole governance structure, because I understand that even at cabinet meetings, general secretaries of the parties are present, which is not the norm in other democracies. So we have a situation where the parties seem to be playing a very major role in governance itself. You see, I guess because it's the party that brings the president to power or brings the parliamentarians to power, and therefore the parties want to claim that, look, we are part and parcel, without us you would not have been elected at all. But that also frustrates the work of parliament. It frustrates the independence that the parliamentarians will have in making decisions for the country. Because oftentimes, the interest of the political parties will not necessarily be the interest of the country. Because the political parties are always looking to win political power, which is different from the interest, a particular interest of the nation. So that divergence in interest will create a problem if the parties are becoming part and parcel of the governance structure. This is an issue that I don't think we have paid attention to at all, because if the party general secretary, and both parties understand, not just the NPP, NDC when they're in power also, their general secretary attends cabinet. But really speaking, they are not members of parliament. They are not even members of government, unless you are given a governmental appointment. Yet, they behave as if they do control the government. So somehow we are creating our own system where political parties become part of the governance structure. Is that good for us? In my view, not at all, because I've already indicated the serious challenge of conflict of interest. Because political parties are not necessarily interested in advancing certain interests of the country, because such interests will be inimical to their own ambition to win political power. So that is where I think the problem is. So your question is a good one, and I think it's one of the issues that we need to look at closely if we ever think of reforming the constitution and our political structures.
Okay, so lastly, what would be from you 3 things that we can do to improve?
Okay. Very, very, very interesting comments we had there from Bafo Jimandia, suggesting that perhaps we may have to pay a lot more attention to that very situation in Parliament and indeed the Constitution as a whole. At this point, I'd like to introduce my guests for today's show, the others who are joining in our conversation, and we are really grateful that they've also taken time off to join us. Rasmu Barak, for instance, has been on for a while now. Rasmu Barak is the former Member of Parliament for Kumbungu. He's one of our guests. He's on with us now via Zoom. Ras, good afternoon. Thanks for agreeing to join us today. We are really grateful you've taken time off to join us. You have served in Parliament, and I'm sure you understand better than any of us may do when this issue comes up. Let me first start by asking this. Is it a reality that Parliament is quite ineffective when it comes to the discharge of its duties due to some of these restrictions and all of these things that happen?
Well, ineffective may be quite heavy,
okay,
but certainly Parliament has challenges in the discharge of, its duties. Parliament has hurdles to overcome in holding the executive to account. And clearly, the problem goes to the heart of the Constitution, which Professor Chimandia spoke about earlier. If you look at the functions of members of Parliament, aside passing legislation, if you read Article 103.3 of the 1992 Constitution, and for the benefit of our viewers, I may read it.
Okay.
103.3, that committees of Parliament shall be charged with such functions, including the investigation and inquiry into the activities and administration of ministries and departments, as Parliament may determine, and such investigations and inquiries may extend to proposals for legislation. Now, if you have an instance where, as we have seen in Article 78.1, that ministers of state shall be appointed by the president with the prior approval of Parliament, except that the majority of ministers of state shall be appointed from amongst members of Parliament. Now, that's actually problematic. It is problematic because in 103.3, Parliament is supposed to provide oversight over the activities of the executive, which may include investigations and the rest of it. Now, if majority of ministers are coming from Parliament, you get to see instances of MPs towing their party line and supporting their party's activities, even if it were not in the national interest. And you may have seen just recently, during the vetting of ministers, where members of the ruling party have basically had little or no questions at all for nominees appearing before the vetting committee. Now, that's completely unacceptable. That is shaking the responsibility bestowed on elected members of Parliament by their constituents. So if we really and truly want to address this problem head on, then we've got to deal with the elephant in the room, which is Article 78.1, which enjoins, which compels the president to appoint majority of his ministers from among members of Parliament. Because clearly, as it is, you keep seeing incidences of members of the ruling party, shirking their responsibility to hold to account, members of the executive. And this runs through even committees. I mean, I can give you the example of the Public Accounts Committee, of which I was a member, where members of the ruling party would play it softly, because persons appearing before the committee are members of the executive. Now, that is worrying. That does not advance the best interest of our country. And I believe that there's been a lot of talk about dealing with some of the challenges we have in the 1992 Constitution. President Mills initiated the constitutional review process. I think it's long overdue, for us to follow through the recommendations of the committee, and one of them, obviously, is the problem with Article 78.1. And there are several others in the Constitution that do not bode well. Again, if you look at the powers of the president is vested with enormous powers. You can look at Article 71, and 71 describes the public office holders that the president appoints. If you may give me a second, I could read to you 71.
Right.
So 71, the Commissioner for Human Rights and Administrative Justice, and the deputies, the Attorney General, the District Assembly Common Fund Administrator, chairpersons and members of Public Service Commission, Lands Commission, the governing bodies, corporations, National Council for Higher Education, district chief executive officers, ministers, deputy ministers. So over a 4-year period, the president appoints more than 2,000, appointees. You can look at, presidential staffers. So the only institution that can hold all of these 2,000 and more appointees in check, it's Parliament. And if Parliament is weak, then clearly we have a problem at hand. Then clearly we would not see Parliament assert its authority. And look at the architecture of the current Parliament. We have a hung Parliament, but in spite of a hung Parliament, you are still seeing Parliament unable, to discharge of its duties as it should be.
And it's very interesting, because I remember very well when this thing happened, when the elections the electoral results were out. A lot of people were like, "Oh, finally, now we have a Parliament which can really hold the executive to account." Only for things to return to the status quo a few months on. Were you surprised by it, though?
I'm disappointed. To say I'm surprised is putting it mildly. I'm very, very disappointed. Disappointed because Parliament, the 8th Parliament, has a unique opportunity, to deal with things that the Ghanaian public expects them to deal with. But unfortunately, you're beginning to see the usual rubber stamping of issues. And I think we also need to visit an issue that the majority leader has spoken about time and again. And I need to, commend him highly for the consistency and the passion with which, he has spoken about how political parties have run their affairs and how it has affected the attrition rate in Parliament. To be honest with you, a lot of people run for elections to be MPs because the MP there has been there for long. A lot of people get Parliament and they are completely lost about why they are in Parliament. So the political parties, especially the NDC and the MPP, would have to be minded, by the caliber, by the election process. The kind of people they open the frontiers of elections to be members of Parliament.
Okay.
For.
I'm happy you've even brought this up. We're going to go into it later on, but I'm glad you've brought it up now. I would like you to hold on briefly because we'll pay a lot more attention to it. At this point, though, I want to bring in that very sound clip of Sir Sam Jonah, as he also iterated a number of things. You've heard Rasmu Barak say some very, very interesting points here, and he backs them with a lot of the things the law itself says. And it's a good point. Let's hear Sir Sam Jonah make similar points and also perhaps propose solutions. Let's hear him.
One of the key considerations for investment is governance. And since 1992, we have elected governments to steer our affairs. But the very nature of our democratic setup, in my view, is our undoing. The three arms of government are like a tripod. For stability, each leg must have enough strength to stand. In our system, one leg, the executive, has more strength than the other two combined. In fact, the two seem to derive their strength from that of the executive. That's weakening checks and balances. Any party that comes to power has absolute power to do whatever they want. The 1992 Constitution is the basis for the current democratic dispensation. It created a monstrous executive which looms large over the other arms of governance structure. And for 28 years, we have failed to make any meaningful changes to strengthen our democracy. Actually, what we have, if you pardon me to say so, is an executocracy, not democracy. The president is supposed to appoint the majority of his ministers from Parliament. So you and I, by definition, that makes Parliament a rubber stamp because no MP in the ruling party will be able to stand up and demand accountability from the executive. They are all scrambling for positions. The judiciary is no different. The president has a determining role in the appointment of all the judges of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice. This festers the perception the situation compromises the impartiality and the independence of the judiciary. Indeed, the large section of the citizenry believe that the judiciary is not impartial, with 85% of Ghanaians in a recent Afrobarometer survey perceiving the judiciary as corrupt and ineffective.
Interesting. Sir Sam Jonah there saying a lot of things that Rasmu Barak has also mentioned, and clearly it's a problem. And is getting us to appreciate why that's a problem. Before we took that sound clip from Sir Sam Jonah, Rasmu Barak was making a very interesting point about how perhaps the modus operandi of a number of political parties in the country may also be a reason why even members, once they are elected into office, are unable to even perform in a certain way. Because again, the party is, okay, the setup is this way. Mukwaya ni Mukwaba. Someone comes, someone must go. And so, Charlie been there for too long. So yeah, go, make her come chop some. That appears to be the principle, and the parties are not doing enough to protect perhaps first-term MPs who are doing very well, or long-serving MPs who have a lot to offer. And so that's it. It's like everybody is scrambling. And so you have to play your cards right. If not, before long, you are off. So I'm glad he's brought it up. Ras, let's continue the conversation. So how much of a problem is that? Because to be very honest with you, I was very sad when I heard that you had lost out in your primaries and the like, and so you're not going to make it to the next parliament. I was very, very sad because I think you've done quite well in getting a lot of people to appreciate, one, some of the concerns in your constituency, two, a lot of the key things. I watched some of your questions during the vetting, and I was quite impressed with it. And so, again, it raises the issue of the attrition and all. But you let us know what kinds of difficulties this perhaps may bring. You were raising that point, and then I had to cut you short. But please, you can continue from that point.
The reality is that it affects our governance. Because look at the amount of investment that the state even puts into members of parliament. When they get in, they go through all manner of training, in-service training, workshops, just to build their capacity to be able to appreciate the process of lawmaking, And you would have instances where somebody's in the constituency and does not even understand why an MP is elected. Just this afternoon, I had had to tell someone who had sent me a message about an incident happening in one of the schools, that he should contact his MP, because MPs are voted to deal with processes and issues of lawmaking, to provide oversight, and beyond that, to be able to accentuate the concerns of people. So for instance, if a factory is being built in a community where the presence of the factory would pollute the water bodies, as we have it in this Galamsey issues, members of parliament in that jurisdiction should be able to raise some of these things forcefully on the floor of parliament. That's true. You hardly even hear, MPs from these areas where, the land is being destroyed, the water bodies are being destroyed, and the rest of it. Talk about the issue of Rosewoods. Apart from the Honorable Clement Park, who's been very consistent in, highlighting and showcasing the effects of Rosewoods, not just, the effects of the cultivation of Rosewood, not just to his constituents, but to the country generally. We've got all of these Chinese coming in and just, destroying our environment, Yeah. You don't get to see these, press the red buttons, that affect the Ghanaian. And many of them don't do that because they clearly do not understand why they are even in parliament. They have run to be elected because, they don't like the face of an MP.
I see.
Well, they think an MP drives to the constituency and doesn't roll down his windows, for which reason
he doesn't respect the people. So they'll vote him out.
His windows to run.
Yeah.
Some of the reasons have been extremely petty. But we need to look at the national interest, the public good. What can we do as a society?
Would you have wished that the NDC had put in place measures to protect you?
So I don't even believe in the concept of protection, but I believe that all the parties should expand the frontiers of democracy. You have a small electoral college where 600 people determine the fate of a member of parliament. And largely, those 600 people are driven by personal gain. I asked the MP to help me, finish my house, and the MP didn't give me money, for which reason, he's not a performing MP. So if you look at how I got to parliament, in 2015, the NDC had the expanded electoral college system, where every card-bearing member of the party, so in my constituency, for instance, you had about 15,000 people who voted. It is highly unlikely that anybody can give 15,000 people plasma TVs to get elected. But if you have a smaller electoral college in a constituency like Adaklu, where the electorates are, the delegates are less than 300, and some other places, you know, in some instances, the delegates are about 1,000. And you have seen the very offensive, you know, the obscene nature with which political party primaries are run, where people, you know, dish out motorbikes, plasma TVs, monies, and all of these. And it goes to undermine the very existence of our democracy, because we keep talking about issues of corruption.
Yeah, that's true.
Without raising questions about how or where these monies
are even coming from. Okay. Again, I like you hold on. I'd like you to hold on briefly for me again. Matthew Yindam is joining us now. He's joining us by phone. Matthew Yindam is a former majority chief whip, and he's with us on phone. Yindam, good afternoon, sir, and thank you so much for agreeing to join us. Let me first, Yindam, can you hear me? Okay, I'm not sure Matthew Yindam can hear me. If he... Yindam, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, great, fantastic. Thank you for joining us.
No, it's not Yindam, man. It's not, this is Rashid Draman.
Oh, this is Rashid Draman. Oh, that's fine. Oh, so sorry. I thought Yindam was also on. We'll try and bring Yindam on and then get his thoughts also on the issue. But Rashid Draman is somebody who is well versed when it comes to issues of parliamentary matters. And so we want to take his views on this though. Sir Draman, I know this may be something you may be all too familiar with, but perhaps is it time for us to take a critical look at it to see whether or not we must make some amendments to our constitution, and perhaps those amendments must be now?
About what?
Okay. On the issue of how Parliament is unable to effectively deliver on its mandate, perhaps due to the state of the Constitution, how the Constitution is crafted, giving so much power to the executive, the situation where it makes it look as though the executive, even though it's one arm of the three, appears to be the whole arm in itself, and is just shedding off some of its powers to the other persons. And this is coming on the back of that comment by Sir Sam Jonas, suggesting that a lot more has to be done if we are to get Parliament to be effective.
Yeah, the issue of constitutional review is one that is long overdue. And I think we are all aware, and this has been spoken about severally, so it's not worth repeating that. I mean, our presidents have so much power that sometimes they don't even need. But for me, I think when it comes to Parliament, maybe there are a few areas where I would like to focus on.
Okay.
The first is, you know, the issue of the autonomy of the institution to determine its own budget and make sure that nobody tampers with that budget. We saw a little bit of that play out recently during the budget session when the Right Honourable Speaker had that exchange with the executive. We haven't seen that happen in this country since the beginning of the Fourth Republic. There is still a lot more that needs to be done. I don't think that Parliament has gotten all the budget that it needs so as to be able to deliver on the triple mandate that is given to it by the Constitution.
But if the issue of budget is resolved, for instance, and Parliament has so much money at its disposal, what does it change? What are they likely to do with such funds? Well, it doesn't take away the powers of the executive.
Yes, it means so many things. Okay. For instance, it means that, you know, all things being equal, I mean, because there are so many variables here.
Hello, Mr. Draman. Okay. Rashid Draman's line may have tripped there. We'll try and bring him back on. Matthew Yindam has rejoined us, I'm told. Honorable Yindam, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Fantastic.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's been a while. But let's cut straight to the issues. You have been chief whip. You've had to, should I say, whip your members into line as and when. How much of a task is that? How difficult is it, particularly looking at the fact that you were solely in Parliament and not focused with issues about the executive, but a number of the members you had to put in line were people who were both members of Parliament and also a part of the executive. How difficult a task was it for you?
Well, let me say hi to your listeners. I think as a whip, it's it's sometimes very difficult to whip your members online. But if you look at the way our parliament is structured, we have no choice sometimes than to try as much as possible to whip our guys on to come and do what the government of the day wants you to do.
How is it a problem? That's what I want to know. How is it
It's a problem because there are people who think that, look, as for this particular policy, I don't agree with it. And I think that as an individual, thinking individually, I should not go to vote for this particular policy. But you cannot also, as a member of parliament who won the election on the shoulders of the party, and you are in government, and you say, no, I am not going to vote what the party has asked me or what the government is asking me to do. That is the difficulty. Okay, and as an executive, you are a member of parliament, at the same time you are a minister. Sometimes we even have difficulties because you see an MP who wants to play and please his constituents at one stage. At another stage too, he's with the executive. He doesn't want to antagonize the executive that he belongs to. This is another dilemma because you have bad rules in your area. You are a deputy minister, maybe under, let me say, gender. You want to ask the minister of rules why your rules are not being fixed. But at the same time, you all belong to the same executive, which per our orders, it looks odd for a minister to be asking a colleague minister a question. I don't know if you understand what I'm telling you.
I do, yeah.
But at one stage, you want your constituents to know that you are pushing for them. You are asking questions in parliament. You want the constituents to know. But as a minister too, there is a conflict there because you all belong to the same government. You are a minister. How can you then be asking your colleague minister a question? So sometimes you see that when you look at parliament, most of the oversight responsibilities or most of the question and all those things is normally done by those in opposition. You see very few questions coming from the ruling government, members of parliament who belong to the ruling government, because it will sound odd for you to be holding your own government accountable. So for parliament to become so effective, we need to look at that link very well. We need to look at it very well.
Some say persons such as yourself are part of the reasons why we are in this mess in quote. To the extent that, let's say you have an MP like, say, PC Apiofori, whom you have to whip into line as often as possible. He has been very vociferous about a lot of things his party did. At the time, he was very, very vociferous and suggested that, well, this is wrong. Well, you are giving bribes out. No, I can't do this. I can't endorse this, and the like. Some say persons such as yourself in leadership in parliament forced him out. People like that.
Yes, I agree. That's what I'm saying. If you take a look at our constitution, the constitution also makes it clear that if you become an MP on the ticket of a party, there is that kind of loyalty. So you cannot easily get up and say you are crossing carpet.
So to you, the loyalty is to the party, not to the people who elected you to begin with.
That is the constitution. It's not about me saying it. That is why when you cross carpet to another party as a member of parliament, your seat is declared vacant. And a by-election has to be held in your constituency. Other than that, you are an individual. Your people voted you. So if you get to parliament and you think that, no, what my party is doing, I have a difficulty with it, I want to do business in opposition, you should be allowed if your constituency gives you the opportunity. But unfortunately, in our case, the constitution is not structured that way. And that is why you see a lot of party interference in parliament. Anytime parliament is having a very huge program, you see all the party bigwigs, both NDC and MP, be trying to show their presence in parliament because they think that the loyalty of the various members or caucuses is to the party. So sometimes it is not like MPs do not have their independent mind. They do, but our constitutions are structured in such a way that sometimes you are forced to toe a certain line, even if you disagree.
Interesting.
So it's difficult. But I am pretty sure that the framers of the Constitution had something in mind.
But that's the thing.
Forward,
we are all looking for that something they had in mind, because clearly it's not working, is it?
No, I think we have grown. We are growing, and we've grown to a level. I am sure some time ago, if somebody tells you that we'll have the kind of parliament we have today, you will disagree. You will disagree. But things are working, although that is not what people wish. But today, the speaker is from a different party, and we have 137, with one person deciding to be forming the majority. It tells you that going forward, the fear that we had, the fear that your budget may not go through, and for that matter, you need your eyes in Parliament. We need to be really looking at it. And experts should also be telling us the way forward, because if we can have an independent Parliament, completely members of Parliament, different from the executive, I'm sure that when it comes to oversight and responsibility, Parliament can stand very, very, very well.
Okay, all right. Ninam, thank you for those words. Do hold on briefly, though. We'll come to you for some solutions. Yourself, Rasmu Barak, and Bafo Ajman, there are a few solutions we would want from you. But before you came in, though, we're taking some words from Rashid Rahman, but his line tripped. Mr. Rahman, mentioning that one of the key things we can do to salvage the situation in Parliament is to ensure that their budget, they have enough budget to work with. And I was asking how enough budget will likely cut the powers of the executive. Yeah, so you were taking us on that education, please. Mr. Roman, can you hear me? Okay. I think his line has dropped again. Okay, so I will now come to Rasmu Barak and then try and get his views on the way forward, because it's clear. And when I hear Nyindam talk about this, it gives me a perfect idea of how bad the situation is, because he is a whip. He's having to get his people into line, of course, to push government agenda. His people, those who may be, should I say, quote unquote, genuinely ready to push the agenda of their constituents, such agenda which may not necessarily conform to that which the government wants to push. There's always a bit of a conflict there. And now he has also raised issues about how it's difficult to even criticize colleague MPs because, of course, you are in the same boat, so you want to rock the boat, you know. So, Ras, what's okay? I'm told Rashid Rahman is back. Maybe I'll just take those words from him before we come to Rasmu Barak. So, can you hear me now, Mr. Rahman?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic, great. Thank you for rejoining us. You were taking us on a bit of an education as to how making enough funds available to the legislature may likely help curb the challenge we find ourselves in.
Yes, so one of the ways, in my opinion, is that, look, if Parliament is properly restored, then it could play that role of a check on the executive. So even if the president has a lot of powers, then we are assured that there is a body that has all it takes.
Yeah. So the question I was asking on the back of that was how that is going to work. How does that work?
Yes, so that's one way. In terms of making sure that the checks are done much more effectively. So that's one way. The second is that there's a practice where members of parliament, parliamentary committees over the years rely on the government departments, which are part of the executive, to fund their oversight activity.
Okay.
So that is almost like taking away the independence and the powers that Parliament has in the first place. And then I was coming to the second point, which is what was my second point? I think the second point relates to the appointment of not ministers, but other key kind of governance stakeholders in this country. For instance, when it comes to the appointment of the electoral commissioner, the chairperson of the electoral commission, who plays a very, very important role in our democracy. I think the role of
Parliament is not quite prominent in that regard. And so I would want to see some of the powers that the president has in that regard, some of those powers taken or shared with Parliament.
I see. All right. So, Norman, many thanks for your time on the show today. We are really grateful you took time off to help us appreciate all of these things. And Rashid Rahman is the Director for Africa Center for Parliamentary Affairs. He gave us those views. Let me come to Rasmu Barak now. Ras, so the way forward now?
So the way forward is to hold the bull by the horn. And holding the bull by the horn means you amend Article 78(1), which requires that the president appoint majority of his ministers from Parliament. That clearly is one of the biggest elephants in the room.
Why do you think? Why do you think that was added to the Constitution? That particular phrase was put in there. That thing.
Well, it's difficult to go into the minds of the framers of the 1992 Constitution, but I believe some of them are still around. The likes of our former Chief of Staff, Nana Tudanti, who was key and instrumental in the process, the likes of Speaker Bagbin. So perhaps they may be the right persons, to tell us why,
because I've heard a school of thought that if you are in Parliament, you appreciate things, you have a different perspective of things. You see both sides of the issue. Usually if you are out of the equation, you only see things in a certain way, and so it's very easy for you to.
The Americans don't have this system, and their system is running perfectly.
Okay.
And you watch committee sittings whether in the Senate or in Congress, see how serious members of Parliament, congressmen and senators are in the United States of America. So we need to get serious if we really want to, Parliament to bite and to be able to hold the executive to account and provide oversight on activities of the executive. So amending 78(1) is critical in a manner that does not require for the president to appoint. I don't even think that any minister, should come from Parliament. You can't serve two masters. You can't be a member of the executive at the same time, a member of the legislature. That is like, serving two masters. So that is one. The second thing is that the practice of members of Parliament trying to do infrastructure development. It clearly defeats our strategy of local government. It's not for nothing that we have a decentralized, governance system or structure, and the DCs are there, the MCs are there, resource them, give them adequate funding to do that, so that members of Parliament can focus on the core business of passing laws and providing oversight. When Parliament is doing bills, considering legislation, look into the Chamber of Parliament and see the number of MPs who are in the chamber. It's an eyesore. And it clearly means that many people who get elected to Parliament are not interested in the process of lawmaking. And I would argue that they have no business in being in Parliament, if they don't have an interest in the process of lawmaking. So until, our country decides that, look, the allocation of DACF, a portion of it, 5% to MPs also, is an albatross. It's one of the stumbling blocks, because an MP gets fixated with trying to build schools, trying to get, water, trying to do A, B, C, and D infrastructure projects, instead of focusing on the core mandate of holding the executive to account. I'll give you a typical example. The Airtel Tigo deal, government acquisition of Airtel Tigo, a company that have posted losses for many years, but for the likes of the Honorable Sam George and others, how many MPs are even talking about it? Because it's the taxpayers' money that is used to buy a company that is posted losses. And we've had an instance where government has 30% shares in, this is not to digress, in Vodafone Ghana. But because government has not fulfilled some of its contractual obligations in respect of the Vodafone Ghana deal, since 2007, Vodafone Ghana has not given the Ghanaian public a peswa in terms of dividend, in terms of profits. And how many members of Parliament are concerned about that? So we need to tune the minds of legislators towards the core business of holding the executive, of those who are appointed by the president to account. And one of those things would be, to get them to move away from trying to do developmental projects. And finally, the way the party elects, the parties elect their candidates for MP. You mentioned PC Appeal for you earlier, fantastic member of parliament. But look at the amount of flack he came under, just because he was speaking the minds of his constituents, just because he was tackling issues of corruption that were pervasive under the President Kufuor administration. His own people, schemed to get him out. So if you really want members of parliament to focus on the right things and to press the right buttons, then we need to do things anew. We've tried the 1992 Constitution for 29 years now. It serves us its good purpose. Things in the Constitution that ought to be relegated to the dustbin of history. And Article 78(1), which enjoins the president to appoint more of his ministers for parliament, is one of those things that we need to amend.
I see. All right, thank you. Ras, thank you for that update. Let me take some concluding words now from Matthew Nyindam. Nyindam, can you hear me? Honorable Nyindam, can you hear me? Oh, unfortunately, I think Nyindam's line may have tripped there. Yes, you can hear me, Nyindam?
Yes.
Great. So we are taking some final words from you as to the way forward. If you could make it brief for us, just 1 minute, please.
Well, just like I said, as for the way forward, I think that as a country we have come very far. Our democracy has grown to an appreciable level, and I think that some of the clauses that does not allow Parliament or members of Parliament to have their independence must be re-looked at. The party excessive interference must also be looked at, because even as members of Parliament, you don't even have the opportunity to elect your own leader. It is done at the party's level. Yes, there are good reasons why some of these things are done, but I think that our democracy for now, we have seen a lot of progress, and those things, the party, and we all must look at our constitution again and give Parliament a space to operate as Parliament. I think when that is done, it will help all of us.
Matthew Nyindam is the former member of parliament for Pandai. He's also the former majority chief whip. He was one of our guests. You just heard him with those concluding comments there. Rasmu Barak, former MP for Kumbungu, was also with us today on the show, as well as Bafo Ajimandua, governance expert, Professor Bafo Ajimandua, as well as Dr. Rashid Rahman, the Director for African Center for Parliamentary Affairs, taking us through quite a lot. And it's clear, change we must, change we shall. My name is Kobna Chencheni Boateng. Many thanks for watching.